Hello student, I am Professor Smita Jha and I am here to discuss class in Victorian England because we are doing this course, these lectures under the umbrella term Victorian literature, Victorian writing. And we all know that how important Victorian age is when we talk of literature in English. So let us start discussing the particular class section creed in Victorian era. So, the Oxford English Dictionary defines class as a system that divides members of society into sets based on perceived social or economic status. In the Victorian era, these classes were called upper, middle, and working. Everyone was deemed to belong to one of these, and which one depended upon a number of things as follows. The Victorian era, like any other ancient time, had a peculiar class system that divided the social setting. It was based on power, riches, working and living conditions. People belonging to the royal family, aristocrats, nobles, business owners, and wealthy families working in the royal courts were classed into the upper class. They were in powerful positions, had the utmost authority, had lavish lifestyle, and enjoyed exceptional facilities. Whereas the middle class included either owned or managed business empires or merchants. They were classified by earned wealth and not inherited wealth and lived a pretty sound life as well. Lastly, the working class resided at the lowest level of hierarchy. It mainly consisted of labored workers who lacked money and hence had a poor way of living. The class system was also classified based on the clothes they wore. The Victorian era fashion trained during the Victorian era was expression of the estate one belonged. The elaborate pieces were worn by the woman belonging to the upper class, middle class woman, wore modest dresses, and the woman belonging to the lower class wore what they could afford. Property, rent, and interest provided income to the very small and very rich upper class. The upper class possessed titles, riches, land, or all three. They controlled local, national, and imperial politics and they held the majority of the land in Britain. The upper class inherited royals. It consisted of aristocrats and all the titled people like the ones from the royal families, lords and ladies, earls, dukes, and duchesses. They did not have to work for generations and could afford to live a luxurious life. There were also business owners who had large scale mining or shipping industries. As they inherited massive wealth from their previous generations, it gave them great access and authority. They were provided with inherited seats in the House of Lords. This gave them the power to vote on political affairs as well. All upper class children were educated. Boys went to boarding schools from the age of 7, and girls stayed at home to be educated by a governess. The eldest boy then learned how to run the family estate and look after the tenant farmer. And any younger brother usually landed roles in the army, navy, or church. The girls were expected to marry men from similar families and have their children. To be middle class in the Victorian era meant that a person became quite rich through their work rather than inherited wealth, like the upper classes. To start with, the middle class was mainly made up of merchants and factory owners. Merchants were men who traded in goods for money. They owned ships that sailed to countries such as India, taking British made goods and trading them for Indian goods such as tea, coffee, and spices. These commodities were then sold back in Britain, making a profit for the merchant. The merchant was an employer, employing a captain and a crew for his ship and men to load and unload the boats. This put him on a similar footing to upper class lords who employed tenant farmers to produce corn, wheat, dairy, and other produce from the estate. Meanwhile, factory owners rented or owned the factory and the land surrounding it. They also employed hundreds of people to work for them. Other middle class jobs included becoming a doctor, a lawyer, a master at boarding school, a builder, an engineer, a banker, or a stockbroker. These well paid jobs meant that the man was able to buy a nice house with a piece of land. This then made him and all the others listed above eligible to vote alongside the upper classes in general election. Middle class children were also educated at boarding schools and by governesses. The boys were then expected to help run the family business, and the girls were expected to make good marriages to men from the middle classes and maybe even the upper classes. The expansion of the middle class during this time was due to the rapid growth of cities and the economy. It was also referred to as the bourgeois and consisted of those who had a skilled job to support themselves and their families. Merchants and shopkeepers became popular occupations as trade, both domestic and overseas, as flourished. The large scale of new industries such as railroads, bank, and government meant that more labor was needed to make sure the cities were able to function. The white collar professions could move up in the corporate ranking and earn a higher salary. It was helpful to have connections to those in powerful positions as they were able to get jobs more easily. Moreover, the middle class was also divided into two categories, higher level and lower level. People from lower middle class typically worked for those in the higher level. The lower class or the working class was made up of the majority of the people in Britain. They earned little money as they were paid only for the hours they worked. The work they did was very physical. The job roles included farm laborer, sailor, fisherman, mine worker, building laborer, docker, factory worker, and servant. Women also worked, despite having children, to earn enough money to feed the family. It was very easy for these people to lose their jobs if they were ill or injured, as there was always someone else to fill the role. They had to rent their homes as they never earned enough money to buy them. The size of the home depended upon how much they earned, which is why most working class people lived in rooms in slum housing, especially those who lived in the cities. This also meant they were never eligible to vote. The children were lucky if they received any education, as most of it had to be paid for, but then education wasn't deemed necessary for becoming a servant or a miner anyway. Working class young adults usually married within their class, and so the poverty cycle continued. The working class consisted of unskilled laborers who worked in brutal and unsanitary conditions. They did not have access to clean water and food, education for their children, or proper clothing. Often, they lived on the streets and were far from the work they could get. So, they would have to walk to where they needed to get to. Unfortunately, many workers resort to the use of drugs like opium and alcohol to cope with their hardships. The underclass were those who were helpless and dependent on the support of others. The poor and young orphans relied on donations to survive. Some women who were unskilled and could not get any jobs became prostitutes to make a living. As they were extremely controversial, Parliament voted to pass the Contagious Disease Act, which allowed prostitution in military town but meant the woman had to be forcibly checked for diseases. The act was meant to protect the men for contracting diseases, not the women from being harmed. This mistreatment created a strong feminist movement among Victorian women who yearned for fair treatment. Finally, in 1885, Parliament passed the Criminal Law Amendment Act, which raised the age of consent and prohibited the use of brothels. During the Victorian age, there was an early baby boom, which led to not only an increase in population but also an advancement of industrialization. The progression of England as a society led to a greater demand for labor from both adults and children. Children took on hard working jobs as coal miners, chimney sweepers, farm worker, and domestic servants. Some children were even forced to take on the role of railroad worker due to the invention of the railway brought by the Industrial Revolution. Child labor became an overarching issue in the early 1800s due to a lack of effort to improve working conditions by the upper class. Because the government was influenced by the wealth to invest in luxury rather than promote protection for laborers, many children suffered at work. The most brutal form of child labor took place in coal mines. Children were required to work 12 to 18 hours a day in mines that were infested with rats and disease and had poor ventilation. Such harsh working condition led to the development of respiratory problems and an increase in mine disaster casualties. The term illegitimacy became popular in England society as the population continued to expand. Many parents, especially those of the lower class, were unable to support and account for their children due to poverty and unstable marriages. It was also common for individuals to have children out of wedlock. A child was considered a bastard in a case where the male would leave all support and care of the child to the female. Bastardy became an issue for children, led to an unstable home life, and more importantly, limited equal opportunity to education. As a result, the bastardy clause was enacted to issue relief for illegitimate children. However, it enhanced the legitimacy of children. The Bastardy Clause, also known as the Poor Law Amendment Act of 1834, prohibited parishes from granting unwed mothers any relief. The law forced women and their children without fathers to enter workhouses that granted them a horrible reputation. However, there were some people who accepted the law as it would provide food and clothing for the poor as well as schooling for children. As the poor women could not afford to support their children, most chose to work as servants and lived in their employer's home without their children. Their wages would pay these other women, called baby farmers, to raise their children. The system functioned well until industrialization and urbanization led to a greater need for different kinds of paid foster. Mothers were determined to keep working in the city as wages were higher, but chose to keep their children in villages and towns with total strangers where conditions were safer. Unfortunately, this form of abandonment led to worsened treatment of children and prolonged child labor. During this period, the roles of men and women became more sharply defined than they had ever been in history. Rather than women working alongside men in family business, the 19th century saw an increase in men commuting away to their places of work, leaving the women home all day to oversee the household. The responsibilities of upper class and aristocratic women were limited because of the common opinion that they were weak. These women had a range of servants to perform the domestic chores for them. So they usually just had to oversee them. An everyday task of upper class women was accepting and paying visits as well as organizing dinner parties for their friends and family. These were occasions where women could prove their homemaking skills and good taste, and to serve as symbols to others about their social status. These women were distinguished from the upper class by having less education and fewer opportunities. Most women worked in domestic service either as a cook, maids, and laundresses to wealthier women. Other women were employed as barmaids, waitresses, chambermaids, and washerwomen. To be able to go to work, mothers would often pay other women, usually very elderly or very young, to watch their children. Working women could not afford to pay for servant, so besides their actual jobs, they had to do all of the household chores themselves. This was used as evidence to support that women should not belong in the workplace because their families were not being properly taken care of. The distinction between the wealthy and the poor concerning law enforcement statement in part from the new concept of a criminal class. In the minds of the upper classes, the members of this underworld lived in the filth of the East End and consisted of the poorest members of society. They lived entirely on the proceeds of crime and preyed upon the respectable people of the West End of London. This idea was popularized by authors such as Charles Dickens and is best evidenced in Oliver Twist, where the likes of Fagin and his boys live in a squalor and spend their time robbing wealthy gentlemen. After the formation and growth of the police force, crime began to decline. The penalties inflicted seemed to be a sufficient deterrent to criminal behavior. Punishment ranged from imprisonment or flogging to capital punishment. And the introduction of psychiatry to the judicial system led to experimental treatments such as the Olation Bible study and forced silence. Others, such as Abel Magwitch in Dickens' Great Expectations, were transported to Australia to serve their prisons. At this time, Britain had a parliament consisting of the House of Lords, whose members were not elected by public voting but by the Lord Chancellor. However, public voting was responsible for the members of the House of Commons. Most of the votes were cast by the upper class and the middle class. They had the right to vote and were informed about various political affairs. However, the working class was unaware of political issues and was not allowed to participate in any political activities. They were not considered important enough to know or get involved in the politics of the country at all. There were essentially two leading political parties, the Whigs and the Tories. The Whigs were against royal power. They believed every man had the right to vote to elect members of the parliament. Meanwhile, the Tories supported the monarchy. It consisted of wealthy officials in high authority who were against everyone being able to cast a vote. They believed only the wealthy and affluent people should cast a vote. By 1884, everyone got the right to cast vote, and later in 1918, women over 30 years old could partake in voting as well. Clothing was a significant measure of one's status. The most respectable people wore the most stylish garments made of finest fabrics and embellishments. Fashion was noticed and acceptable more than intelligent conversations in any social setting for a lady. A typical fine dress would consist of a huge sleeve, a tightly fitted corset around the waist, and a voluminous skirt. The ladies from respectable families represented themselves as modest and led back with a movement restricting shoulder lines and corsets. Their evening dresses exposed their shoulders and neckline, and the corset cinched their waist for a tiny waist appearance. Soft colored fabrics were preferred during this era. As for their hair, the women in the Victorian era had long hair tied up in a bun with curls hanging on both sides of the head. They accessorized their hairstyle with bonnets either plain or heavily ornamented. Hair extensions and artificial flowers and butterflies were also used to accessorize. The women preferred their makeup to be very minimalistic. They showed off their pale skin and sometimes smudged their cheeks with rouge. Makeup was used mostly by the people working in the theater business. For mourning, women had to wear all black for 2.5 years. During the last 6 months, women were allowed to wear shades of white, grey, and purple. Boots were very popular footwear for both men and women during the Victorian era. The boots were laced in the front with pearl buttons. Later, they started contrasting the color of their boots with the color of their dress fabrics. The Victorian era was pretty famous for having birds on their hats. From the feathers of the bird to actual birds on their hats, the demand for such accessories increased during this period. The rich often wore layered clothes with intricate designs. However, fashion was merely an option for the poor. The same went on for children as well. The working class had a very rough life. They worked every day to sustain the most basic life. Luxury was not an option for them. Sometimes their entire family, including the women and children, had to work to increase their family income. Thus, the Industrial Revolution contributed massively to this transition in society. The Industrial Revolution started with the reign of Queen Victoria in 1837. This era covers a long period, more than half of the 19th century. In the early periods of Queen Victoria reign, there were various problems in the country because of the fast and irregular development of the industry. While the middle class was prospering, the working class, which made up the majority of the population, was heading towards poverty, and there was a migration towards cities, which resulted in an increase of population in suburbs. Furthermore, developments in science shaked faith in belief, and there was moral corruption. Apart from social transformation, the emerging factory system posed several management problems, different from those ever encountered before. The church could organize and manage its properties because of dogma and the devotion of the faithful people. The military could control large number of personnel through a rigid hierarchy of discipline and authority. And governmental bureaucracies could operate without having to meet competition or sow a profit. The managers in the new factory system could not resort to any of these devices to ensure the proper utilization of resources. Industrialization created a lucky upper class without offering any benefits to other classes. This strange contradiction coming with the Industrial Revolution was a usual conflict of the Victorian era. Many writers of the age wrote on this topic, and the ones who criticized the social structure of thought were named as reformers, and their novels were classified as novel of social reform rather than a social novel. From a philosophical perspective, the theoretical premises of the Industrial Revolution are paved mainly by positivism, economic, and utilitarianism. Positivism has been theorized by the French social scientist Auguste Comte. According to Comte, positivist philosophy adjusted the chaos which came out after the Enlightenment. Positivist thought stood against theological and metaphysical thought in the first place. Comte stresses the importance of positive scientific knowledge. Accordingly, non scientific ideas are evaluated as nonsense. For information to gather a scientific nature, it must be based on observation and tangible data. Comte's thoughts were systematized through John Stuart Mill and Emily Durkheim's studies, and the foundations of positivists, though, have been laid. Positivism is a period in the middle of the 19th century when the positive thought emerged in France, England, and Germany. The age of science started in this period because the society was living in the science industry age, which was led by Enlightenment, French Revolution, and Industrial Revolution. The new way of life, which was based on science and mechanics together with the thought of Enlightenment, had features which prioritized consumption of specialized machine produced goods rather than thriftiness of agricultural production based on muscle power. It was necessary to direct these changes in the society, which was freed from a structure of the Middle Ages and saw fundamental changes in every field according to positivist principles. At this point, positivism had an important role. The individual who produces knowledge should be impartial and should not blend his or her own thoughts. An impartial scientist and objective data are the main acceptances of enlightenment. general thought of positivism, as in physics, is that it can reach definite results about realities. Political economy science, or economy science with its contemporary name, is one of the most important foundational premises of industrial revolution, which was first defined by the Scottish economist Adam Smith. In his work, The Wealth of Nations, which was published in 1776, Smith evaluates the factory system and manpower as the source economic wealth rather than agricultural production. He asserted that the sources can be used efficiently, with the human labor and division of labor designed as an assembly line, and the national income rises with the production. Adam Smith argued that the mechanism of the market will regulate the structure of the society as an invisible hand. He said that as long as the individuals acted according to their needs, national wealth will increase constantly, while any kind of intervals with the market will affect the natural flow of the economy and hinder the maximization of social benefit. It is also important to note that thrift, responsibility, and self reliance were significant components of Victorian middle class culture that could be used to characterize a society where individual tenacity and energy were required for success. Although very few families belonged to the middle class, it was a pleasant life for the middle class in the Victorian era. The middle class was different from the upper class in terms of the history of their wealth. The wealth they had was earned wealth, as in they either owned or managed large businesses and collected a pretty good amount of wealth. People from working class were sometimes forced to live in confined, poor qualities homes, and families were frequently crammed into a single room. Thus, the Industrial Revolution resulted in enabling the class distinction in Victorian England. This class division could be seen in all kinds of fields, from politics to fashion. Even though the upper class and middle class enjoyed all the privileges, movements led by power class or the working class enabled to bring about a sense of equality, at least in the sense of politics and that of voting. Hence, it becomes an important topic that needs to be discussed when talking about Victorian society. With this, I conclude this discussion of the class in Victorian society, which is very informative, I suppose, for you as well. Let us meet in the next lecture with other topic. Till then, thank you very much.